Hi, folks. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes. It's about 6 minutes after I have, to see if a couple more people may come on. It is a nice Saturday afternoon after a rainy morning. And we know it's deliciously hot out there, so may not be as many folks wanting to be looking at a screen for an hour on the Saturday afternoon. So thank you for those who have taken the time to be curious about Owen Vernon Gordon's work. Thank also those who've already come by to check out the show. We have had a good steady stream of visitors booking in for the isolation visits. So please remember, if you're interested in seeing the work, you can book an appointment. You can do so through our website, and you can also call the gallery. Some people have just taken a chance and come by, and we've had windows where they've been able to come through. We've had a lot of really positive feedback, in particular about some of the art historical references that people see. So we'll start with Modigliani with a short clip of Owen referencing one of his pieces, and then a clip just giving some context for those of you who may not know Modigliani and his work, just to see where there's some connections with respect to the construction of face based on African masks and the African influences in both Owen's work and Modigliani's. And then we'll move into the second clip and show some work related to the storytelling components of Owen's work. And then the last clip talking about his favorite artist, a Canadian artist, and then sharing some more images and before taking some of your questions and comments. We are lucky to be in a house at Band that we own thanks to Scotiabank. So we want to thank them for their support for exhibitions and for the work that we do in this space, ranging from our visual artists to emerging performers on the performing arts side, as well as the stuff we do with visual artists. Also, just want to mention that Owen is going to be showing in the fall, late November, with Nicolas Metivier Gallery. They actually came by earlier this morning for a visit and to meet Owen for the first time. So thanks to Nick and Sarah for stopping by and for supporting this Black Canadian artist to get his work out to a wider audience. And finally, the work is for sale. So if you're interested in purchasing something, please feel free to follow up with us, and we can coordinate with you to hopefully help you acquire a piece of Owen's work. We will, if Claudia tells me it's okay, we will move forward with the first short clip, and we'll get going and enjoy some time together with this work.
Yes, the Mother of Ska. Her name is Sister Ignatius Davis. She's now deceased, but she was a nun who was in charge of the Alpha School for boys. Some came from the Maxwell Park Children's Home when they got older, and some were just boys who got into trouble, and their parents wanted to send them to a school, but it wasn't like a reformatory. But she taught music, and she taught a lot of boys, and some of Jamaica's most famous musicians came through her, like Don Jomans, Ricky Rod Ricketts. Even send them to one fellow to England with their own money so he could advance in his musical career. She actually, as you'd say, the foundation of Jamaica's reggae music today, because reggae came from rocksteady, and rocksteady came from ska. Before that, everybody's just a little woogie-boogie thing from the States. I don't think she's recognized, except amongst the musicians, but culturally, I don't think she's recognized as the mother of the music. They just recognize her as a great nun who did all these things to these boys.
Modigliani was a highly gifted young Italian artist. He forged his own path and created an entirely new vision. The NGV's portrait of Manuel Humbert is a painting of a close friend of Modigliani. In looking at the work, we can see assurance and confidence of Modigliani as an artist, the strong lines that are drawn from Modigliani's study of African sculpture. He did not align himself with any of the schools of art that were thriving in Paris at that time. He forged his own path and created an entirely new vision and married the Renaissance and the African traditions of art together to create a singular vision that had never been seen before in the history of art.
Hi there, folks. We're just going to talk a little bit after those two clips, the one with Owen giving some context for the Mother of Ska image, and then the Modigliani. And we shared that just for you to show. For those of you who've seen the work, you see why there's obvious connections made, especially in the construction of the elongated face. So Owen, I'm wondering if you can start just by talking a little bit about your early training in Jamaica at the Jamaica School of Art, and whether or not, I think when we spoke, you said Modigliani didn't come up. He wasn't one of the people that you got background on as art history based.
Yes, the Renaissance painters, and Untitled was one. And they didn't do much lecturing on the Renaissance, but there was a vast library with all these books of the Renaissance artists, but there was no public, there was no modern artists. Any modern art was in the school itself, produced by the students. But there were no teaching of modern art and nothing like that.
Do you think the African connections in your work is more based on your own African roots and not so much from you going to Europe and seeing this work?
Well, I've never been to Europe or Africa, and I actually know that it's from the roots, our African roots, in West Africa, where they do a lot of wood carving. And I believe that come along from Africa with us, genes, our persona of expressing ourselves. We had no other choice. Unless we were trained and tutored by Eurocentric art, then we'd be painting or sculpting like Michelangelo. But we had to go back to our roots without being taught it. It was natural. It's like any other thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a gentleman yesterday who came to the gallery who said he felt as though he could see where you had traveled and seen things in Europe. And I said to him, I didn't believe from our conversations you had been to Europe. So when we were talking earlier, it made me realize to some extent that subconscious element. And you did talk about the fact that you do carvings and you do have masks and sculptures that you've carved. Was there training from that, or was that work that's just what you did naturally?
Wood carving came natural. Just I imagine, like in Africa, you take your hedge and your wood and you just carve without any blueprint, without any, some of the work you didn't even have a foreseeable model in your head. Mm-hmm. You just knew that you're going to carve something and it came natural. And as you go along, you find the image that you were looking for.
I'm wondering if there's a piece that we should maybe talk about within that context of Jamaica, because there's a few images, as you know, in the gallery, some of your work that is created that specifically talks about or comments on some of Jamaica's artists as well as Jamaican culture. So there's the indigenous piece, Miso Jamaican, there's the sculptor, Cecil Boyle, as well as the Junkanoo. Which one do you want to start with?
Well, I'd like to talk about Mr. Boyle.
Mr. Boyle, yeah. So we'll let Claudia pull up that image of Cecil Boyle, and then you can start talking a bit about his significance for you.
Well, Mr. Boyle was actually one of Jamaica's greatest potter. He did some beautiful ceramic, and also a professor, I believe, of art. He taught ceramic at the Jamaica School of Art. But that was not the campus upon which I did. There were two campuses, one on North Street that did painting, fine art, and commercial art. And there's another one in a nice little area of Kingston that, not far away, that was only for sculpture and ceramic. But Mr. Ball would come and visit at the school where I work. He was a very famous, very well loved, and unfortunately he died. But he had quite an history. He was a veteran of the World War, I believe World War II. And I believe he got wounded or something, and he's ended up in Egypt. While he was in Egypt, he happens to study some ceramic with some Egyptian pottery. And I believe they taught him how to use a specific glaze. I believe there was a green glaze, totally unknown to Jamaica. And I believe Mr. Ball took it back to Jamaica, because I saw a lot of his works, and they were tremendous. They were extremely beautiful, the way it is glazed. He was a professional glazer. Like anybody could turn out a piece of work, but it's a finish. Mr. Ball had his own style. You could see the image of Ball just looking at a piece of work. And I tried to see if I could set that image of Cecil Boy at his workshop.
The next image is the Junkanoo, and you have an interesting story about seeing or witnessing Junkanoo for the first time as was it 8 years old?
Yes, I was about 8 and never saw them before, and it was Christmas Eve. And I heard the drumming, and we used to see a drumming, and we'd run up to the gate, because most of the houses on my street are extremely far away from the gate. So we'd run up there, and all the adults were gone. It seemed like I was the only person in this huge premises. And then I look out, and there's a silhouette of cow. I never seen people wearing cow horns on their head. And you could just see the horns and the funny costume. And then, of course, there's a character that is the devil, all black with a fork. He came up to the gate, and I ran down to the house. I'm not sure if I ran under the bed. I knew the dog was under the bed because firecrackers had been fired, and he didn't like it. But I probably was on top of it on the sheet. But the next day was Christmas. And sometime after Christmas dinner, we heard this bang, 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 and went, oh, gee, they're people. And right there, I lost my fear, because the reason I was afraid, never saw them before, this weird imagery. But during the daytime, I was able to recognize those people dressed up in costume. And I fell in love, like most Jamaicans, with the Junkanoo ever since. And unfortunately, there's Junkanoo bands today, but they're not as authentic as the original band, because the original were poor Jamaican people. They made up their own costume, and they were so creative. But I noticed of the modern Junkanoo band, they all dressed in tailor-made suits. They had brass instruments, and it became a sort of a commercial pop art. And I was hoping that sometime in the future, maybe people could revive the true Junkanoo spirit with maybe a stage show or something where you can actually see the vivid costumes that they put together.
Your comment about the authenticity is similar, I think, throughout Carnival threads. We hear the same criticism here in Toronto with Carnival and with Caravana, and even some parts of Trinidad, that it's become more glitter and tiny little things with a lot of glitter and feather, and the roots of Carnival seems to be getting lost.
That is correct. I've noticed that too, because the original, well, I think Carnival was way before I could recognize that. I was probably too young. But from what I used to see on the news, never been to, well, I've been between both islands, sailing on a ship, but I've never set foot on the Trinidad culture. And I noticed, yes, it has become commercialized. Like they're printing out these costumes in a big shop, probably made overseas, while the original people used to painstakingly make their own costume, and nothing show the creativity as if when each individual put their own touch to something, as opposed to going down to the store and purchasing it.
The last piece we'll take a look at before moving to the next video in the next segment is Me So Jamaican. And this was fascinating for me because Jamaica is not one of the islands, as you know, that is necessarily mentally really conscious of the indigenous people who would have been there before the arrival of Europeans and Africans. And your work because of that history of highlighting, I believe was the Arawak.
Arawak, yes.
Yeah, it was the indigenous Jamaica was Jamaica or in that region?
That's a good point you made. You made about the not recognized. That is why I did this painting, because Jamaica has a lot of problem now with bloodletting. And I believe the reason we're having this problem is the spirit of these people were technically wiped out by the Europeans. They're not at rest. We need to come up with a powwow in Jamaica to honor these people so their spirit can rest. We need to get a shaman from Central America, a Native American shaman. And he comes and he does the blessing, the praying, the burning, the incense and so on, so their soul can rest. I believe if their soul is not at rest, we're always going to have turmoil in Jamaica. That's just my opinion from a spiritual point of view.
Is this painting a commentary on that missing spiritual reckoning or that sense of peace?
It was not the sense of peace, but they tried to get people to recognize that these were not just people in the loincloth like they showed in the European drama. You can see the coat of arms, they were almost naked. No, they made things. They made beautiful garments. They wore fabrics and cotton. It was a society that is very advanced, and they just got wiped out. And I suspect their spirit is hovering around. And of course, their site is being demolished. Like they found some historic site somewhere near Portmore. I don't know if it's there today because they built a huge city in Portmore. And I suspect some of the ancestral grounds of these native Indian ancestral burial ground has been desecrated. And it only had to the spiritual discontent that these people might be feeling.
Yeah. It's an interesting position, the notion of Jamaica just being about the horrible loss of lives of people of African or loss of life of the indigenous people for the region. Those two things colliding together, which may speak to, as you said, that sense of chaos that is the society spirit is unrested because of that.
Yes, and even some of our ancestors are unrest too. I hate to be morbid, but I believe from the foundation of our country, it has been blood soaking into the soil. The blood of the Native Americans, and now the blood of the African, and now we have the blood of our people now, citizens.
Yeah, today. So we're going to pivot a bit and start to look at you and the way you approach storytelling from a global perspective and your interest and curiosity in the commentary from that global perspective. We're going to run this video, which is talking about this gentleman who's a director at
Greg Williams.
Yeah. So Claudia's going to play us that video, and then we'll come back and take a look at some more work.
This picture is to honor a lady named Mrs. Dora Wheatley Carey, and she took in two boys they weren't orphaned, but their mother deserted them. And they were actually mulatto children, but they wouldn't know it, and so was the father. The father used to pass for a Greek, because in the part of America they lived was a very racially discriminating area. So if they knew he was black, they wouldn't come to his store. But his mother used to come to visit. So the little children thought she was the maid, because he couldn't tell the children that, because, oh, then they said, oh, he's black, he's not Greek. Well, he tried, but then his business failed. Well, he took them to their grandmother, and she was not pleased, because first she didn't want to have any children now at her age, and because the resentment from the fact that they thought she was a maid, and of course they were almost white, so she had a phobia about that too. They weren't neglect, but they were just lonely and sad. So Miss Carey was a friend of this lady. She visited one day and noticed these little boys here just shy, and she found out what happened, and she took them in immediately, took them to her house. She raised them up, and one of them, the eldest one, is now a dean of economics at Muncie University. Professor Greg Williams, and his younger brother. He met in this racial accident. It wasn't very pleasant. But this lady, if it were not for her, these boys would not have been amount to anything.
The work was going to talk a bit more about the story or say anything else about it, Owen, before we move to the next image?
Really, because I would end up repeating Professor Williams, because the story was actually related to a social media by Dr. Williams.
Where he talked about his personal story?
Yes, he was giving a lecture at Munster University to some student, and I watched it. Very interesting, and I downloaded a website that he put there and got some more information. And so all that I know of this lady and the Williams is what Professor Williams actually wrote.
Storytelling was the thing that I saw was the strongest element of your work. I remember the first time I visited your house, you had a backstory for almost everything. And there are a few things that even in your imagination, you were depicting something that you had imagined. And so one of the pieces we wanted to take some time to talk about was one that really fascinated me that we came across when Amin and I went to visit for preparing to co-curate the show. And that is the image of Mr. Pip. We'll have Claudia pull up the image. But do you want to talk a bit about this story? I believe you said it was an island in the South Pacific.
Yes, it's called Bougainville. And I've been having lots of trouble over there for a while. And apparently Mr. Pip was a French actor who was married to a local lady, and she was also an actress, and they decided to return back to the Highland. And I guess Mr. Pip was sort of like not playing with 100% a full deck. But he wasn't insane or anything. As you can see, he built a cart and he worshipped this woman. So he took her around on this cart that he pulled around. She never get to walk. But the trouble started when, it was a very peaceful place. There was wars in some other islands. It was a network of islands, I believe. Well, the trouble is some rebels came for shelter on the island. Somebody sheltered them and everything was okay. But some children, to honor Mr. Pip, they took shells and they spelled out Pip on the beach. Now, the men that they call Redskins, they're not Redskins, they only call them that, but they're... Apparently the Redskins are flying in the helicopter and they see this. Well, that was helicopters. And they could landed and made some inquiry and threatened some people, and of course somebody turned over the two wanted men, which they promptly executed. And you can notice there's an image of a lady. She's also there. She came with her Bible and is giving them a lecture, and they just executed her too. And eventually Mr. Pip, they shot him at the same incident because they wanted, who is this guy? And of course, he probably didn't explain. He wore a little thing on his nose, like a clown's nose, but that's all. And of course, they proceeded to do other things, and they burnt a house, they left the church. If you notice, there's a large building in the background with people in it. Well, traditionally in those highlands, there's always a building that if there's a war going, if you go into that building, the enemy cannot attack you in this building. It's only made out of straw. But you can watch them steal the stuff, burn everything in the village, but it's sort of it's a tradition from a long time, where these people have some very serious tradition in fighting. They fight helicopters, and the traditional wars they kept. And until a certain house, then they go home, took a nap, then in the afternoon, fight some more, and then they go home and cultivate. Their philosophy was, if you don't have food, you cannot fight. So they believed, and they grew potatoes. In fact, that island, the British botanists went there and discovered fossils of potatoes. They were planting sweet potato in those islands for over 60,000 years.
Wow.
Above all, my favorite artist is Tom Thompson. And I didn't understand how he came about doing what he did until I went to the museum in Kleinsberg and I saw his palette. And I realized that he couldn't afford paint and he couldn't afford to waste it. Because I wondered why some of his landscape had a red or a green sky. Because what he did, he cleaned his palette. Instead of having it hardened, he cleans it off every night and then he takes up that piece of masonite and then he do a landscape. And it's shameful to see my palette because it's that thick. So you could say, boy, this is a affluent time we live in. Compare with the days when Tom Thompson had to go 80 miles just to buy a tube of paint. I just go across to the mall and there's a paint. We have it sort of easy these days.
Compared.
And I'm wondering if that influences our behavior in art, because sometimes the easy life don't make you want to be that creative. But if you know your meal depend on it, you're going to do the best. It's just my assessment.
Sorry, folks, we were muted for a while. I was just asking Owen if he can comment on that idea of struggle, because I found it interesting that you had an affinity to Tom Thompson, because I come from the school of anything to do with the group of seven is more about kind of old white Canadian idea of art. And so when you referenced him as one of your favorite artists in the context of his poverty, it reminded me of how class factors in and that identification with a struggling artist. So I wonder if you want to talk a bit about that.
Yes, I believe Tom Thompson was one of the greatest artists, and I believe he is still the greatest artist, landscape artist Canada has produced, because of his originality, the raw originality of his art, and beside he was not a rich fella, and I can sympathize with his lifestyle. Having not been rich myself and having to suffer, and I guess it's not mentioned in this. I have a book of Tom Thompson written by one of our contemporary, but it didn't mention all this suffering. I am sure Mr. Thompson went about many afternoons just to buy a tube of paint. Well, I had the same problem. I could not buy the paint or the meal. So I can relate to Tom Thompson's his energy, his suffering, and I can relate to the man totally. And of course, he does this beautiful and vivid landscape. And unfortunately, he died just when he was branching out into abstraction. There's one abstract painting, I believe he did. It's on the cover of a book that is titled Tom Thompson. Beautiful book. But I still not knowing if I'm going to upset other Canadian artists, but I say Tom Thompson he didn't get the recognition until recently. He made a park. I think there's something in Ontario Gallery, but it's always a group of seven. There's stories that he actually knew these fellas, but they had a little thing in Rosedale, where the subway station is now. One of them lived there, so if you live in Rosedale, you're not poor. Well, I imagine Tom Thompson was this country fellow who come down to visit them. They might politely accept him, but he wasn't their class. And the style of art is not their class. I mean, the group of seven does some beautiful work, but I find they're bland and compared, Mr. Thompson. They're Eurocentric with a Canadian flavor, but they're not the true Canadian roots as what Tom Thompson produced for us.
That's fascinating to hear that idea of true Canadian roots being attached to struggle at that level. I wonder if it's time that we take some questions. If people have questions or comments, I'll let Claudia see who may have their hand up, and then we'll give people a chance to speak to Owen or to say, either make a comment or a question, or if you have a question.
We have someone asking if Jacob Lawrence is an influence for Owen.
That's a very interesting question. I actually purchased a book of Mr. Lawrence's work. It was a very interesting story, being a member of the Navy and is supported by his superior officers, which I find it is very impressive. Typical Americans, you know, they really respect culture when they are ready to do so. And he was helped. He was allowed to do his work on the base. And I think his work is tremendous. I've not been influenced by it, but I don't think his work is so unique that I don't think I'm licensed enough to even attempt to do his style. I hope that answered the question. If there's any more I could say about Mr. Lawrence, I would be willing to.
Is the Navy part of an influence because you were a sailor for a bit?
Well, yes, I used to be a merchant marine. I think the relationship that we could relate to, both Mr. Lawrence and myself, as sailors. But I didn't have a superior officer who would have assist me in, you know, maintaining my art or anything. Yes, he's a great artist. I like his style, especially the way he does those black figures. And it reminds me of some art I used to do prior to meeting him, before I read his book. But I don't think I was as good as he was. I hope that answered the question.
Hi, Owen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hey, it's beautiful work, and it's really interesting to hear your reflections and discussion. So thank you for that.
Thank you too.
I've had a chance to take a quick look at the work on the walls, and it's truly stunning. But what you were saying about Tom Thompson is really interesting, and it made me sort of wonder if you ever have worked in like doing landscapes, or how has his work sort of influenced yours? I kind of see it in a lot of the way that you play with light and color, and just from observing. But I was wondering, particularly about landscapes, if you ever dabble in that sort of territory.
Yes, I was doing landscape before I purchased the book of Mr. Thompson, and I tried to see if I could imitate his style. But I just couldn't until I visit to the museum up in Kleinburg. It didn't have any Tom Thompson, actually. It had a whole bunch of group of 7, but it was one item that I believe was the most valuable piece of Canadian artifact. It's the palette of Tom Thompson.
Right.
Because I learned so much by looking at the palette. It was clean, no paint. So I realized, oh, that is how he did the landscape with the green sky and all the red skies. In the evening, he'd clean off the palette and daub it on his next painting. And that is why you find a sort of an abstract feelings to his landscape. And I think that has to do with the fact he could not afford to waste any paint because of the way he wasn't rich. But I think I will be influenced by Mr. Thompson in my future landscaping, because now I have an idea. In fact, I attempted myself, but I didn't have the patience to keep wiping off my palette. Well, I get a thick blouse of dried up paint, which is a shame. You know, paint should be used for creative purposes.
Yes.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, thank you. If you were gonna start, if you're saying it might start doing some more landscapes.
Yes, I will.
Would which landscape landscapes do you think you'd be drawn to, like the landscapes here in Canada, or places from your memory, or other stories? Because that's another through line of the work that is so powerful.
You mentioned the memory part, because I figure I could do some Jamaican memory, but what I end up with is a bunch of phony hills and mountains that do not have a geological station. And so I prefer to do my landscaping in Canadian landscape. You know, painting it. That's proves. I think that is sort of my own style, but it was like, whoa, that's not a tree. I want to survive today, but we're still later, which is a because I should have used it as my own stuff landscaping. But Canada does offer some very interesting place to landscape. In the fall, especially in the trees and valleys and all this that you have to get it just.
They asked about how the partnership between Band and the Metivier Gallery came to be, and then does this mean that Metivier will be representing Owen's work?
So we have a relationship with Metivier that goes back to Gordon Parks. We partnered with Metivier for the first time in 2013 when we did a museum show for Gordon Parks, and Metivier represents the Gordon Parks Foundation for the sale of his work in Canada. So that show happened for Contact 2014. This team have been generous in advising us at different times since then. When we produced the Ehrzeit's Voice Catalog, they supported us financially with that initiative, and also have advised us in other respects where needed. So there's a good professional relationship there, and we've called for advice and assistance at times. So honestly, when I saw Owen's work for the first time last fall, after Betty Julian suggested he come and see us last summer, and we were planning for this year's works to be shown, Nicholas was the first person I thought to call because I knew he understood how to manage estates, and Owen has like 40 years of work in his home and is way beyond the scale of what Band normally does. So we haven't talked about a full representation, but we have talked about how to work together to help ensure that Owen gets the audience and the recognition we believe the work he does and is doing deserves, not just here in Canada, but hopefully internationally. So yeah, that's the plan. We're excited for the partnership and excited for the opportunity it allows for us as a small gallery to learn, but also for an artist like Owen to get the dues that we think he should for the quality of his work.
Yes, I met Nicholas for the first time this morning. I liked him immediately. I think he's a wonderful man, although he was wearing a mask, but his eyes tell all the truth about him. And I'm looking forward to working alongside him. And of course, for what I can achieve, and we both can work together, and I get fame, and I suppose I'll get some recognition at the same time.
No pressure, you guys, no pressure at all. Fame. Fame and recognition. I'm looking at Sarah. She's like, yeah, Karen, we'll look that up tomorrow. The honest eyes. Whoever told Nicholas Metivier he's got honest eyes? I love it. Our internet is wonky, so hopefully you can still hear me. I think we're still okay. We'll probably take one more question so we don't tempt fate, because this has gone, I will not lie to you, way better than I was expecting. Is that you, Nikki? You got comments for us, Nikki?
Oh,
Go.
just a question.
Sure.
Hi, Mr. Gordon.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I do have a question about your narrative, so your paintings. Is there a common link at all that you found between the stories that you choose to paint? Or is it just whatever strikes your fancy and is interesting to you?
Well, yes, you're right. It's whatever suit my fancy, sort of. But there's no personal links.
Mm-hmm.
But emotional link, of course, like the Rwanda, there's a painting about the Rwanda victims. That, it touches me for all the trouble and the pain and suffering they're going through. And the same with the Professor Williams story. I was very saddened at the fact how their life took the turn. I felt, mind you, when I heard the story, Professor Williams was a grown man about my age, but I still could empathize with his childhood and the trauma it must have caused, from a nice affluent family to a grandmother who didn't like you, and to a lovely lady who took care of you. It must have been, you know, a bit of a culture shock and all around for them.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, ma'am.
Nikki came to the gallery and we had a conversation about the restaurant piece, Owen, because she thought it was a photograph and I hadn't noticed, but she noticed. She didn't say that she's actually an art student at OCAD. And this was her visit to this exhibition was the first after being on lockdown and not seeing art in real life.
It was very therapeutic.
He wrote something about it, so we'll definitely make a point of sharing it with Owen before we post it out in the world. We're hoping she'll be able to get it published, which is why we haven't sent it anywhere yet. But
can I get a little snips?
Yes, we can. We'll definitely share it. We'll give him
you get the special treatment, Mr. Gordon, for sure. Nobody else. The restaurant piece, I had found it really interesting because the common gaze with so many of the figures in the painting, the way that they seem to be looking at the viewer made me think that perhaps it was they're kind of all looking up, and they have this curious look on their faces. And I immediately thought, oh, I wonder if he climbed up on the balcony or something like that and was hanging over and taking a picture, because they just looked so amused and like perturbed.
That's
and but then Karen told me that it wasn't from a photo at all. That was just the way you painted it. So what was your inspiration for that piece?
Well, I believe that they were supposed to be looking at some distraction. I assumed that it could have been an imaginary me with a sketchbook. And who's that guy? We're trying to have a supper. But
that's the vibe I got.
I did notice that before I even completed the painting. And I figured it would be appropriate to keep their head looking that way. Because if they're looking at their meal or waiting for the waiter, it's sort of like, I'd have to paint the back of the head or the side. But that's very observant. And I think I should like to see what you wrote.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for answering my question.
You're welcome, ma'am. Have a good evening.
So I'm going to someone asked if we could show the piece. So I'm just going to walk this back because it's easier for me to do that than to try and show. Can you see? It's the restaurant. You really have to see it in person. I feel like I'm not doing it justice, but it is in the back corner there in all its glory. And I never noticed that common look of the gaze is all pointing in the same direction until Nikki pointed it out. Thank you all. Unless there's a burning question or comment, I'm not gonna tempt fate any longer with this internet. And I'm gonna say, is it raining again? I just looked outside. Has it started to rain? hopefully the rain will stop and you'll enjoy the rest of the weekend. Thank you for taking the time. Look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in the gallery, and look forward to seeing folks in some capacity in the fall at Métivier's space. Again, if you have any interest in purchasing, I don't want to say it, but I will say it, which is, you know, Métivier plays at a different level. So if you're interested in purchasing something and owning some of Owen's work, you may want to come see us first. I'm going to let Owen say a final goodbye, and then we will sign off. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for watching. It's been a pleasure meeting you on Zoom, and look forward to meeting you in person sometime in the fall at Nicholas Gallery. And I suppose I shouldn't tempt fate in this internet breakdown. It could be a lazy way for not having a written speech to say goodbye. But it's been nice meeting you all, and have a good evening. And please stay safe in this pandemic time we're living in. Thank you all.